This is my Think Aloud for Stone Fox, written by John Reynolds Gardner and illustrated by Marcia Sewall. I start with the illustration on the first page, and it appears to be a young boy and his dog, but based on the title of the book, maybe I think it's a fox. I'm not sure from the illustration. I'm making a prediction that there is a young boy in the story, and also potentially a dog or a fox. I also look at the illustration and think about the time period that the story is set in. To me, it does not appear current. It looks a little bit older. So my prediction is that the story is of an older time period. Looking at the title page, I don't think a lot about that. It's pretty blank, so it doesn't give me a lot of information about what the story is going to be about. On page 3, the title of chapter 1 is Grandfather, which makes me think that this chapter is about someone's grandfather. I recall the first illustration and think back about that. Is it the grandfather of the young boy in that illustration? The text goes on to say, at first little Willie thought he was playing. I remember the little boy from the illustration on the front and think about, that must be little Willie. On this page, I continue to make connections when it mentions that little Willie lives on a small farm with his grandfather. I make a connection to my childhood. I grew up on a farm, and although my grandparents didn't live on the farm with us, they visited the farm on a daily basis. I think about my grandfather visiting that farm and everything we did as a young child. McGregor states on page 30, using what kids already know can help us do what we do better. If kids grew up on a farm, they can make a connection to this story. I know I did when reading it. In this instance, I'm using my experience growing up to better understand the text. This page also talks about how grandfather likes playing, and it also gives examples of tricks he has played. And I can predict that in the story, somewhere, grandfather plays a trick. Does he work with little Willie to play that trick, or is it a trick he plays on little Willie? I guess I'll have to wait and see. As I turn to page 4, it talks about how grandfather would get up early, really early. In fact, early enough, it was still dark outside, and he would make a fire when he got up. Again, I go back to my question about the time period, and I think about that a little more, about the time period when I looked at that illustration. McGregor talks about the importance of questioning on page 63, and that it is important to ask questions while reading, but you don't always have to find the right answer. So I questioned the time period when I looked at the illustration, and I'm questioning that again now, and I still don't know that answer. I think about how people had a fire in their house oftentimes before they had electricity, but sometimes people still have a fireplace in modern times. So I continue to assume the story is set in a time period when little Willie and his grandfather did not have electricity in their house. As I continue reading this page, I see that grandfather seems to be an early morning person, but this morning he's still in bed. Little Willie thinks his grandfather is playing yet another trick on him by still being in bed. And I make a connection back to my earlier prediction that at some point in this story, grandfather is going to play a trick on someone, potentially on little Willie. So I think that, okay, he's playing a trick here. I continue to read, and at the bottom of the page, the text reads, but grandfather didn't answer. Little Willie ran out of the house. Okay, well, that doesn't seem normal, and at this point, I began to think something might actually be wrong with grandfather. Maybe grandfather isn't really playing a trick. The text on the top of page 5, says a dog is sleeping on the front porch. I connect back to my earlier predictions about the illustration, about a dog or a fox being part of the story. As I continue reading farther down the page, it talks about how the dog, named Searchlight, is an old dog. And I think back to my childhood pets. And I think back about it very fondly. We had an old dog named Sugar. Oh, and I loved her dearly. I'm feeling nostalgic and thinking fondly of her. At this point, I'm making a connection between the text, the old dog, Searchlight, and my childhood pet, Sugar. As I continue reading, I see that little Willie has ran to visit Doc Smith. From the name, I assume that Doc Smith is a medical doctor and something is really wrong with grandfather. Little Willie is obviously worried. He wants Doc Smith to come quick, and he's out of breath from the run. I also make the inference that Doc Smith is an older woman based on the description of her. Snow white hair, covered with wrinkles. And I think about and visualize all of the elderly women in my home church growing up. Thinking back, it seems like all of the elderly women in my home church had what I would call snow white hair. McGregor states on page 91 that reading is an incredibly creative act, and that to read a book is to listen, to visualize, and to see. In this moment, after reading about Doc Smith, I'm visualizing her. I'm picturing what she looks like. I'm thinking about the elderly women in my home church growing up in snow white hair and trying to put them together to paint this picture of Doc Smith. As I read on page 6, I can infer that Doc Smith is familiar with grandfather's tricks. As she states, it's probably just another trick. As the page goes on, little Willie and Doc Smith, they continue to talk as little Willie answers her questions. At the end of the page, I can infer that Doc Smith thinks something must be very wrong, and the text states, Doc Smith stopped reading. Earlier, I thought that Doc Smith was familiar with grandfather and she knew his habits. Okay, so now she must know something is really wrong. On the top of page 7, the next page, Doc Smith questions that grandfather went to bed without playing his harmonica. That must be something he does on a regular basis. And I'm guessing that is something that occurs every night with grandfather. Right when little Willie nodded and confirmed that grandfather went to bed without playing his harmonica, Doc Smith clearly knew something was wrong. As I read, Doc Smith shut her book and stood up. I can almost hear a hardcover book closing. And I think about the times I've heard books close in a rapid fashion. It is a very specific sound, something I can picture in my head. And I'm thinking about when I've heard that sound. I continue to read and see that Rex was Doc Smith's horse, more specifically a Palomino. I try to think in my head, visualize what a Palomino looks like, but I can't quite place it. When they got back to the house, Searchlight goes to grandfather's side and rests her head on his chest. Again, I'm taken back to my childhood and to my lovable dog Sugar. And when possible, she would always be by your side. I start by looking at the illustration on this next page, and my thoughts about Doc Smith are confirmed. She is an older woman. She has snow white hair. She appears to be almost exactly what I was picturing her to be earlier. I also see Searchlight right next to grandfather with her paws on his chest next to him. The text on page 9 starts out with Doc Smith addressing little Willie with, "Must you ask so many questions?" While reading that, I can almost predict that Doc Smith is worried. She seems concerned and wants to find answers about what is wrong with grandfather. Again, I see this after Willie asks a question and her response is, "Hush." I think about the times as a child. Maybe I was asking too many questions during a stressful or inappropriate or not the perfect time. After Doc Smith finishes her examination, she walks over to a window, and I think about why she's looking out that window. Is she looking for answers? Is she looking for clues or predictions? She asks Willie follow-up questions each time, and Willie states that everything is fine. The crops are good, that that grandfather doesn't owe anyone money. And at the bottom of page 9, I'm seeing that little Willie is growing more concerned with phrases like, "What is wrong? And why don't you tell me what's wrong?" It's a sense of urgency. I can almost feel that as I read it. As I turn to page 10, I feel relieved as I read that Doc Smith states there's nothing wrong with grandfather. She uses the phrase healthy as an ox, and I think back to my grandfather. I feel like that's something he would say. As I continue to read, I find myself having to slow myself down, and I just want to figure out what is wrong with grandfather. Doc Smith describes what is happening as him not wanting to live anymore, and that makes me sad. I think about little Willie and how that may make him feel. I was a young child when one set of my grandparents passed away. I kind of made a connection back to that. I think I was too young to fully understand death and what happened, but I know I miss them and I missed them when I was young. As I make this connection, I almost become emotional, as I just want grandfather to be okay for little Willie's sake. On page 103, McGregor states that as we read, original thoughts take shape, and then it expands as we encounter new information, and I'm doing that here. I have some thoughts about little Willie, and then as I continue to read, they take shape and become more emotional for me. Little Willie talks about all of the things they do together. Fishing, going to the rodeo, turkey dinners. And it's just very sweet, and I think about that and about their relationship. As the chapter comes to a close on the next page, page 11, little Willie is determined to find out what is wrong with grandfather and make him want to live again, as is the dog Searchlight. As I read this, I can't quite predict what is wrong with grandfather and why he maybe doesn't want to live, but I want to find out. And inside, I really want grandfather to get better for little Willie's sake.